All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Mitchell, and I'm Chair of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. I'm going to call to order the meeting for November 8th, 2023. And I would ask Nate to go ahead and read the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Roll call, Vice Chair Larkin.
Present.
Larkin present. Commissioner Crutchfield. Crutchfield absent. Fraze. Fraze present. Knutson. Knutson present. Ladd.
Present.
Ladd present. Middlebrook. Middlebrook present. Moore.
Present.
Moore present. Morath. Morath present. Morin.
Present.
Morin present. Mueller.
Present.
Mueller present. Reeves.
Present.
Reeves present. Saxena.
Present.
Saxena present. Chair Mitchell.
Present.
Chair Mitchell present. Madam Chair, there are 12 members present, 1 member absent.
All right. First item on the agenda is approval of the draft meeting agenda. So I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda. Commissioner Middlebrook makes the motion. Do we have a second? Commissioner Morin. I have to learn everybody's names. It's so hard. Commissioner Morin seconds. Thank you. Any discussion on the agenda? Hearing none, please go ahead and take the vote on that.
To the Middleburg motion to approve the agenda, Vice Chair Larkin. Larkin, yes. Crutchfield. Crutchfield absent. Fraze. Fraze, yes. Knutson. Knutson, yes. Ladd.
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Middlebrook. Middlebrook, yes. Moore. Moore, yes. Morath. Morath, yes. Morin.
Yes.
Morin, yes. Mueller.
Yes.
Mueller, yes. Reeves.
Yes.
Reeves, yes. Saxena.
Yes.
Saxena, yes. Chair Mitchell.
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 12 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
All right, and with that, the motion to approve the agenda is approved unanimously. Second item on the agenda today is approval of the draft meeting minutes from October 6, 2023. You should have all received those about a week ago. So I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Commissioner Middlebrook makes the motion. Do we have a second? Commissioner Knutson seconds. Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, we'll go ahead and take a vote.
On the motion to approve the October 6, 2023 draft meeting minutes, Vice Chair Larkin.
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Crutchfield. Crutchfield absent. Fraze. Fraze, yes. Knutson. Knutson, yes. Ladd.
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Middlebrook. Middlebrook, yes. Moore. Moore, yes. Morath. Morath, yes. Morin.
Yes.
Morin, yes. Mueller.
Yes.
Mueller, yes. Reeves.
Yes.
Reeves, yes. Saxena.
Yes.
Saxena, yes. Chair Mitchell.
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 12 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
And with that, the motion to approve the agenda is approved unanimously. I just want to remind everybody, even when all you have to say is yes, please do turn on your microphone for that brief second, because the folks who are listening online can't hear you say it, even if we can in the room. That's just the way the mechanics of this work. So just want to remind everybody to make sure you turn that microphone on. All right, so I'm excited about the agenda today. For those who are new, at this time of year, we always have a review of what's been going on data-wise for sentencing over the past year. And it's going to feel a little weird because the data always runs a year behind the year that we're in. So 2022 is the data set that we now have the ability to look at to see what sentencing looked like in 2022. So we're going to start off with the review of the data that we have from our research team, and then we're going to move into some some big idea thinking for the comprehensive review, another discussion that I'm very excited about today. So I am going to hand it off to Nate or whoever you want to take the show away.
Well, we'll hand it off to our new research analyst supervisor, Leah Bauer, to lead the show.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Nate. So we are going to be spending the next 20 minutes or so highlighting data from the sentencing practices data summary section of the draft 2024 report to the legislature, as Commissioner Mitchell just talked about. Keep in mind that this is descriptive information. It is intended to describe and summarize patterns and trends. Also, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to ask. And if you have questions after, maybe once you kind of let the information absorb, you have questions or need any clarification, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We'd be more than happy to talk with you. All right, so we're going to begin. We have put this presentation together by focusing on certain highlights. So we have 5 highlights that we're going to spend the time talking about. The first highlight focuses on the volume of felony cases sentenced and how it has continued to rebound since the drop in 2020.
Hang on one sec. Looking online, I'm not seeing the presentation, so I'm not sure if you're sharing your screen yet.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to recognize that Commissioner Crutchfield has joined the meeting, so let's go ahead and add him to the roll. Commissioner Crutchfield, I'm going to give you the same lecture that I just gave everyone else. So while they're getting ready, we're now in a room where the people online can't hear us unless we turn on a microphone that's in front of you. So whenever you want to speak, make sure you flip that on and then flip it off when you're done. But thank you.
All right, are we good? Can you see the screen? I mean, on the WebEx? All right.
Yeah, we can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, much better. That's much better than just listening to me yak. You can now see what I'm talking about. All right, so back to the highlights of this presentation. We're going to be talking about the volume of felony cases sentenced, as I just said, and how they've continued to rebound after the 2020 drop. We're going to highlight some key differences by race and ethnicity at the different decision points. We're going to talk about the growing gap between recommended and pronounced prison sentences. We are going to talk also about the variations we're seeing between with sentencing by geography, which we mean judicial district. And then finally, we will talk about certain offenses that received downward dispositional departures at higher rates than others. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jill.
Thank you. Okay. The volume of felony cases was over 16,000 in 2022, and as a proportion of cases sentenced, person offenses, shown in dark blue, made up the largest volume, followed by drug offenses in light blue. Felony cases were up by 13% in 2022 after the increase of 25% in 21 and the decrease of 34% in 2020. So cases appear to have rebounded to pre-pandemic numbers. As Leah said, there are key differences by race and ethnicity. And unlike past presentations, we're going to present all the race and ethnicity slides together so we can better focus on those differences. The first key difference is that between Minnesota's adult population, its felony population, and its prison population. Minnesota's adult population is 83% white, shown in dark blue. By comparison, the felony population is 56% white, and the prison population is 49% white. Minnesota's Black population, shown in green, is 7% compared to 27% of the felony population and 37% of the prison population. And the state's American Indian population in light blue is 1.5%, compared to 9.3% of the felony population and 9.1% of the prison population. And Minnesota's Hispanic population and Asian populations at the top of each bar are more proportionate. The distribution of felony defendants has changed over time from 82% white in 1981 when the guidelines were first implemented to 56% white in 2009, which is a decrease of 26 percentage points. This was largely due to an increase in the percentage of Black defendants. The next key difference is that between the presumptive and actual prison rates. Presumptive prison rate is the rate at which the guidelines recommended prison, which was a record high 38.4% in 2022. The Black population was recommended prison and received prison at a higher rate than the total population. The white population was recommended prison and received prison at a lower rate than the total population. Variations may be explained by the proportion of cases in any particular group who are recommended a prison sentence by the guidelines based on the severity of the offense and the defendant's criminal history score. Another way to look at this key difference is to look at mitigated departures. The two types of departures on this slide are mitigated dispositional departures in blue and mitigated durational departures for executed prison sentences in green. A mitigated dispositional departure means that the guidelines recommended prison, but the judge stayed the sentence and the defendant was most likely put on probation instead. A defendant may get up to a year of local jail time as a condition of their stayed felony sentence. A mitigated duration means that the defendant got less time than the guidelines recommended. And in this slide, we focus only on those defendants who went to prison and got less time. The white population had a higher mitigated dispositional departure rate, but a lower durational departure rate than the total. So in other words, they were more likely to get probation instead of prison. And if they went to prison, they were more likely to get the guidelines time. The Black and Asian populations had a lower mitigated dispositional departure rate, but higher durational departure rate. So more likely to go to prison, but for less time. And the American Indian and Hispanic populations had lower mitigated dispositional and lower durational departure rates. So they were more likely to go to prison and get the guidelines time.
All right, moving on to the third highlight, which is the growing gap between recommended and pronounced prison sentences. So we're going to start with a little background information. This top line here is the total incarceration rate for those felony cases sentenced.
Sure.
And this top line makes up what you'll see the next two lines. So the green line is what we're calling conditional confinement, or you can think of it as local confinement. So as a condition of probation, the court may impose up to a year of local confinement, and people on probation usually serve their time in a local facility, such as a county jail or a local correctional facility. They are also often given intermediate sanctions, such as treatment, either residential or non-residential, restitution, and fines. And then that bottom line is the state prison rate. And so in 2022, the total incarceration rate was 85%, 60% of it was the local confinement, and about 25% was state prison. And then on the next slide, again, a little bit more background information about sentences and the duration. So again, the top blue line is the prison length, and the average prison pronounced sentence was 49.4 months in 2022. Yes, I read that right. Okay, do note that lengths do vary by applicable grid. So there are 3 sentencing guideline grids. So the average duration for the standard grid was 45 months. For the sex offender grid, that average duration was 78 months. And for the drug offender grid, 50 months. And then that green line is that local confinement, and that is in days. So the average was 88 days. And then moving to the next slide, which is our highlight, shows the growing gap between the recommended and pronounced prison sentences. So how to read this graph? That bottom line, that blue line, is what we saw in 2 slides ago. It's the state prison rate. Then the brown dashed line is the presumptive prison rate. So think of that as what your policies on this commission directly control. And then those vertical blue bars or lines show the gap between the two. So for example, in 2022, There were 25% of the cases were sentenced to a DC or a state prison. And yet the sentencing guidelines recommended imprisonment at the record high of 38.4% of the cases. That gap is 12.8%. And actually the gap was a little bit bigger the year before. It was 14.6%. And I think another takeaway from this graph, if you look at it over time, is that the difference between the two were relatively stable throughout the 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s. That gap was around 4 to 6%. After the mid 2000s, we see that gap growing from about 4 to 7%. In 2010-ish, in the teens, that continues to widen to 7 to 10%. And then in the recent couple of years, we see that gap growing to between 13 and 15%. So.
Okay, next we're going to talk about the variations by judicial district. Like with the race and ethnicity slides, we're going to present these together to focus on those differences. Here's a map of the 10 judicial districts. Clockwise, starting at the top, is the 9th district, which includes Moorhead. Then the 6th in northeastern Minnesota, including Duluth. The 3rd is down in the southeastern section of Minnesota, including Austin, Rochester, Winona. The 5th is over in southwestern Minnesota, including Mankato. The 8th is west, including Morris. The 7th is north central Minnesota and includes St. Cloud. And then the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 10th districts are in the 7-county metro area. Okay, this slide shows the differences between the presumptive or the recommended and actual prison rates by district. The 2nd district had the highest prison rate and the highest presumptive prison rate compared to the total rate. The 1st district had the lowest prison rate and the 8th district had the lowest presumptive prison rate. Variations may be explained by the proportion and types of cases in any given part of the state. For example, some counties have fewer presumptive prison cases. Grant County, a county in the 8th district, for instance, had just 15 cases total in 2022, and only 3 of those cases, 20%, were presumptive prison, which is lower than the total rate of 38%. Okay, now Katie's going to talk about more differences by district. Katie's joining us online.
Thanks, Jill. Departure rates also vary by judicial district. The mitigated dispositional departure rate by district ranged from a low of 30% in the 9th district to a high of 56% in the 2nd district. Downward durational departures, in green, among prison cases ranged from a low of 5% in the 8th to a high of 39% in the 2nd district. And we can note these observed variations may be partly explained, again, by regional differences in case volume, charging practices, plea agreement practices, as well as differences in the types of offenses sentenced and criminal history scores across regions and available local correctional resources. First, I want to briefly explain why we look at departure rates. The purpose of the guidelines cannot be achieved unless the presumptive sentences are applied with a high degree of regularity. Sentencing disparity cannot be reduced if courts depart from the guidelines frequently. Certainty in sentencing cannot be attained if departure rates are high, and prison populations will exceed capacity if departures increase imprisonment rates significantly above past practices. So in 2022, 71% of all felony cases sentenced received the presumptive guideline sentence. The remaining 29% received some type of departure. Among the aggravated departures was a new type of departure, a departure from the new 5-year presumptive probation cap. Such a departure occurred in 0.7% of the 2022 cases. And as you can see here too, a small number of cases received 2 types of departures. And this slide displays dispositional departures. So in 2022, the combined mitigated and aggravated dispositional departure rate was 15.2%. 15.1% of those was made up of mitigated departures, and only 0.1% were aggravated. Now, effective with the 2015 guidelines, a sentence that is executed pursuant to a defendant's right to demand execution is no longer considered an aggravated dispositional departure. And this change has resulted in a decrease in the aggravated dispositional departure rate from previous years. In 2022, there were no aggravated dispositional departures due to the defendant's request to execute their prison sentence. In contrast, in 2018, for example, requests made up 54% of aggravated dispositional departures. And the last highlight we will discuss is offenses with high departure rates. Dispositional departures rates vary by offense. On this slide, you see the total mitigated dispositional departure rate of 39% and rates for offenses with the highest mitigated dispositional departure rates. The mitigated dispositional departure rate was 47% or more for the offenses you see displayed. Second-degree assault and failure to register as a predatory offender have statutory mandatory minimums, but also statutory provisions that allow for sentencing without regard to the minimum. In all offense categories, amenability to probation or treatment were the most frequently cited reasons for departure. In 67% of all mitigated dispositional departures, the court stated that the prosecutor agreed to, recommended, or did not object to the departure. In 12% of these cases, the court stated that the prosecutor objected to the departure, and the court did not supply information on the prosecutor's position in the other 20%. If you recall, aggravated durational departures occur when the court pronounces a duration that is more than 20% higher than the presumptive duration, and a mitigated durational departure occurs when the court pronounces a sentence that is more than 15% lower than the presumptive duration. So overall, 20% of prison cases got less time than the guidelines recommended, and 2% got more time. Aggravated durational departure rates were highest for second-degree murder. Other offenses we've seen over the years that make this cut are crim sex offenses. At 41%, mitigated durational departure rates were the highest for failure to register as a predatory offender. And in 44% of all aggravated durational departures in 2022, the court stated that the prosecutor agreed to, recommended, or did not object to the departure. And there were no cases in which the prosecutor objected. In 56% of the aggravated durational departures, the court did not provide information on the position of the prosecutor. In 74% of mitigated durational departures, the court stated the prosecutor agreed to, recommended, or did not object to the departure. And in 6% of these cases, the prosecutor objected.
All right, so in summary, the volume of felony cases sentenced continued to rebound after the 2020 drop. We saw key differences by race and ethnicity by decision point. We see a growing gap between recommended and pronounced prison sentences, particularly over recent years. There are sentencing variations by geography or judicial district. And we see that some offenses receive downward dispositional departures at higher rates than the average. Now, I know we've blown through all this information. We have limited time on today's agenda to get through everything, but I hope we were able to provide some at least foundational information for your conversations later in the meeting. If you have any questions right now, we can answer, or again, feel free to reach out to us at any time. We'd be more than happy to talk to you. We love data. We are research geeks, so please feel free to reach out anytime.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. To the members of the commission, does anyone have a question? Commissioner Crutchfield.
Sorry, Ms. Bauer, going back to slides like 7, 8, and 9, when you talked about the disparities, does that correlate with an increase in people of color, the population of people of color that came into Minnesota from 1982, because you had a expansion of people of color coming in, both Southeast Asian, African American, and East African.
Yeah, and that is a great question. Slide, I can't see the whole slide. Do you want to answer?
Thank you, Commissioner Crutchfield. Yeah, I don't know that we can answer that, but I think that is one, that is one thing that could be explored further, if there is that correlation necessarily. You know, we had said that this is descriptive statistics, so we don't know, but I think that's a really interesting question that you ask. But when you do look at this graph, you know, you do see that influx, as you said, of the Black population increasing. I don't know if I gave, when I said it, when I introduced that slide, I don't know if I said exactly the number, but let me find it. It was 11% Black population of felons in 1981, and then that went up to 28% in 2009. So that's 17 percentage point increase at the same time period as that decrease of 26 percentage points for the white population.
Thank you both.
Commissioner Crutchfield, anything else?
I just want to thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Nate, did you want to say something?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Crutchfield, we will be subjecting you to a few more slides in just a minute, and one of those slides actually does incorporate race rates. So it looks at data as a percentage of the population. So that may partially answer your question.
I believe it will. Thank you.
Any other questions? Just want to make sure I'm getting everyone. Okay. All right, well, it's a lot of information. And so I would encourage, especially the new members, there's a lot to be thrown at all of us, but I'd encourage you all to take a deep look at the information. We'll see it again because it will be part of the content of the annual report that we submit to the legislature. So as part of our annual cycle, we'll be taking a first look at that in December, what the report will look like, and then we'll be approving that in January, most likely, or somewhere around there. So we'll see it again. Continue to ask questions because these are the questions that help us dive in deeper and do better work. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Nate for the next part.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to follow up on what you were just saying. So in advance of preparing the report to the legislature, we give you these data slides. It's sort of an executive summary of the data section of the report to the legislature. And the data section of the report to the legislature is sort of an executive summary of our annual data report. So if you really, really want to dig deep into this stuff, in a few months, we'll have published our annual data report that really explains descriptive statistics for what happened in the world of sentencing felony cases in Minnesota in 2022. So what I'm going to do now is sort of back out a little bit, and in preparation for your comprehensive review. It's not a staff-led comprehensive review. It's a commission-led comprehensive review. But we as staff just wanted to give you a little bit more data. Some of it's going to repeat what you just heard, but what I think of as sort of the big 5 issues that, 40 plus years of sentencing statistics in Minnesota have given us. It's another way of thinking of it is, well, let me pull that up. But another way of thinking of it is if I were, had a magic telephone and I could talk to somebody from 1979 Sentencing Guidelines Commission or 1980, and they wanted to know how are the sentencing guidelines doing. And I just had a few minutes to talk to that person. These are kind of the big 5 things that I would say, kind of the elevator pitch. So,
and while you're pulling that up, I also want to make the point that not every commission has data like we do. So one of the best things that happened when this sentencing commission was created in 1979 was that there was also a dedication to tracking data and information so that we could make informed decisions as we moved forward. And in fact, the first guidelines were based on a review of sentencing that occurred at that time, like a much more manual review because they had to go out and get the data, right? But the first guidelines were grounded in the data. And so I just want to really underscore how lucky we are to have this information to give us the picture. Some of it's not pretty, like we just saw in the slide with the racial disparities, but we are lucky to have this information so that we can make thoughtful decisions going forward. And I think what Nate's going to tell us is the data should also play a role in what we want to do with a comprehensive review. At least I agree. I think it should. So I just, since you had a second there, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that this is not something that every state has. And we are very lucky to have this information.
And this is just scratching the surface. So I'm assuming that your comprehensive review is going to be very data informed. And so this is not by any means some deep analysis for you. It's just kind of pointing out some big issues that are out there. So the first one is the annual average criminal history score is climbing. So in 1981, the average criminal history score was 1. And in 2022, it's 2.9. And it's a really interesting shape to this curve because it's almost exclusively just an upward climb. And what I find interesting about this is I am not aware of any policy. I mean, part of these years are my years as executive director. I know some of these years are Chair Mitchell's years as executive director. I'm not aware of any point in time where the commission came up with a policy to say, we need to increase criminal history scores. Criminal history scores are unfairly low and they don't accurately capture that. But somehow, as if on autopilot, criminal history scores have been climbing. And it's not, as far as I know, correlated to crime data or anything like that. There's no similar comparable curve that reflects crime data. So this is a mystery to me, and I'm not here to offer any explanations, but the annual average criminal history score has been climbing. The second one, which is probably related, and if you kind of flip back and forth between point number 1 and point number 2, you'll see that the slope, the shape of the curves is pretty similar. But the percentage of felony sentences for which the sentencing guidelines recommend prison has also been climbing. And when you think about the fact that one of the 2 key factors that the sentencing guidelines use in recommending prison is criminal history score, we may have the explanation for this in the previous slide, but we don't know. As Ms. Bauer pointed out, these are just descriptive statistics. We don't at this point have the data to tell you exactly why, but it certainly could be that it's this average criminal history score that's climbing. But it's quite a jump, isn't it? 15% in 1981 to 38% in 2022. And I guess a jump isn't really fair when you're talking about 41 years, but it's quite a steady climb. The third point is is the mitigated dispositional departure rate among presumptive prison cases. So these are the cases where the sentencing guidelines recommend prison, but the sentencing court, being informed by the prosecutor, the defense attorney, victims, and the probation officer, and anybody else who gives the court information, decides, no, we're not going to follow the sentencing guidelines recommendation. We're not going to send this particular defendant in this particular case to prison. And that's been about 40% of guidelines recommended prison cases where the defendant has not gone to prison, which is interesting when you think about the purpose of sentencing guidelines, to create guidelines, to create standard by which people, ordinary cases should be sentenced. But, if the departure rate is 40%, are they really working? And this has to do with what Commissioner Crutchfield was talking about. The different rates persist in sentencing and imprisonment. Just for simplicity, we're taking the two racial groups that have the highest differences from the white rate. So what we're seeing here on these two slides are ratios between the sentencing rate for the American Indian population to the white population and the Black population to the white population. So for example, in the right chart, we're talking about imprisonment rates. In the left chart, we're talking about sentencing rates. So the question that it's answering is, if you were to have taken, let's just look at this 9.3 to 1 here on the right side. It says Black 2022 9.3 to 1. So what that means is, if in 2022 you were to have taken who have randomly selected a Black Minnesotan, and in the same year you were to have randomly selected a white Minnesotan, I'm sorry, a Black adult Minnesotan and a white adult Minnesotan, it would have been 9.3 times more likely that the person you randomly selected would be in prison among the Black pool that you selected from versus the white pool that you selected from. And you can see that rate was significantly higher, particularly in the Black population in previous years. And this slide, by the way, does not go back to 1980. It only goes back to 2002, just because of how we got really having to do with U.S. Census Bureau data more than anything. But you can see that is going in a downslope. So it is getting closer to the white line. The white line is one to one. It's defined as 1. So you see the blue line at the bottom, it's just 1. It's getting closer to that line, but it's certainly far from it. And you can't even say the same thing about the trend for the American Indian line. If anything, that's rising among the imprisonment rate and more obviously among the annual felony sentencing rate. And then that was the fourth issue. So the fifth of the big 5 issues is that the guidelines are growing in complexity. And I don't necessarily need a data slide for this. You can just turn to your neighbor who's a guidelines practitioner and say, is that true? And that person will surely nod his or her head. But to support it by data, so I'm not picking a typical example, but I'm picking a prime example. If you were to look at Section 2B of the sentencing guidelines, which has to do with the criminal history score. We've already talked about criminal history scores. But that section fit on 3 pages in the 1980 sentencing guidelines. Now, to be fair, there weren't any commentary in the 1980 sentencing guidelines. But today, with the commentary, that consumes 25 pages, and we're probably using a smaller type than they used in 1980. So that certainly has gotten more complex. And the chart measures the number of words as counted by computer in the various editions of the sentencing guidelines. And you can see that it's pretty steadily increased. It's increased by about 150% since the 1981 edition, when they did have commentary, versus today. There was a drop, and Chair Mitchell could tell you about that, because there was a guidelines rewrite that was not intended to decrease. It was not intended to change the policy of the sentencing guidelines. So it wasn't a comprehensive review, but it was designed to make the guidelines easier to use and simpler. Am I saying that right, Madam Chair?
Yeah, I was trying to make plain language, trying to put the guidelines into plain language so that they would be more understandable.
Yeah, so
So that's the only drop, and I was the director at the time. I just want to say that.
yeah, and it was a significant drop, but unfortunately those gains have been eroded away, and we're now looking at over 40,000 words. So that's really all I had to say, Madam Chair. I'm going to turn it over to Matt, unless there are any questions for me on any of these 5 slides.
Questions from the commission or comments? Commissioner Saxena.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I was curious, I'm trying to find the slide number here. The slide that talked about the increase in, you were saying it was a kind of an surprising direct increase. It's slide number 2. in criminal history scores. I'm curious whether we have data about an increase in recidivism during the same period of time that would explain why any given defendant has a higher criminal history score over time.
I'm not aware of any, longitudinal increase in, like study in recidivism rates over time. I don't know about that. I know that, the crime rates over time don't follow this curve, but I couldn't tell you specifically about recidivism.
Right, and one thing that I will say that's not obvious from any of our data, and that we haven't had put in front of us, is that in any given year, the majority of people who come in actually have a pretty low criminal history score, 0, 1. Like the majority of people are first-time offenders who come through. So there's a smaller group of people who accumulate criminal history, but that adds up over time as we look at the averages. So.
And it's possible for a first-time offender to have a high criminal history score, which seems counterintuitive.
That's true.
But you can, if you committed multiple offenses and you're being sentenced for multiple current offenses, the offense you just got sentenced to, even though it wasn't in your history at the time you committed the offense, can be added to your criminal history score to increase the presumptive sentence for the next offense that you're being sentenced for.
Sort of understanding this trend is not a simple calculation. There's a lot that goes into it. So if it's something that we want to know more about, it would take a little research project, right? To really unpack it and figure out how those scores are growing. Is it a particular part of the score that's growing? Is it particular offenses that are driving, higher scores? I know that when I was the director, for instance, Katie, who talked to us earlier, noticed a trend in sentencing for child pornography cases, that there was more of an instance in multiple images being charged as separate offenses. And so a person could come in and get all the way to the other end of the grid in one court appearance because of the compounding use of each image to increase the criminal history score on the next one. So, some of it's charging practices, some of it, there's like a whole lot, there's so many things it could be. So it's unpacking it takes a bit.
Speaking of doing additional research, Madam Chair, it may benefit the commission to have a piece of news when they're going through their next analysis. Do you want to share that with the commission?
Yeah, absolutely. I meant to do it earlier and I forgot. So the good news is that the University of Minnesota team that was here last time saying that they could help support us in the research goals for this review has been approved for funding. So they just have some, agreements to enter into with the funder, and that'll make it official. But so far they've been approved, and I personally am very excited that we're going to have their support. I think our staff is very excited that we're going to have their support. We're going to have a lot of work ahead of us to figure out what we want them to work on, though.
Borderline delirious, Madam Chair.
He sent the best GIF when he found out the news. It was the little kid running in the sprinklers. That's great. Okay, so next item on the agenda is actually getting into some of our principles and goals for the comprehensive review. I'm going to turn it over. We have several consultants here from MAD. I'm going to turn it over to ask you to introduce yourselves and then take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm Charlie Selu. Good to be before you all again. Can you hear me okay, or is the mic working? Great. So I'll introduce myself and then we'll turn it over to my colleagues. So Charlie Selu, I'm a consultant at Management Analysis and Development, and we're the state's in-house management consulting practice. As I mentioned last meeting, I've done work in the past with public safety projects with the Department of Public Safety, the State Fire Marshal, Homeland Security, Emergency Management, and the Ombuds for Corrections, as well as public engagement work with a variety of different agencies. So I'm pleased to be here.
And my name is Stacy Sjogren. I am also a senior consultant with MAD. I've been with MAD for 6 years. Most of my background through the course of my career has been working with governing bodies, so I've allowed a lot of time sitting in rooms such as this, working with boards of directors on their process and participating in meetings as best I can to be able to help them. What might be of interest to you is that I've got experience as a MAD consultant with the governing body at the Board of Public Defenders, the Guardian Ad Litem program. I've also worked with Adult Protective Services as they've been engaging with public processes to help revise their statutes that affect their program. I've also worked with the board at LCCMR, otherwise known as the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, so has the same composition issues and working together. And that's a little bit about me, and I'll turn it over to you, Shamsa.
All right. My name is Shamsa Dayo. I don't have an extensive work experience like my colleagues here, but I just recently started MAD in September. I had some experience working at the Hennepin County Public Defender's Office, as well as another law firm in DC. I also had some experience with implementation of a strategic planning for civic engagement with a nonpartisan and independent organization in Philadelphia, as well as some constituents affairs and community advocacy work at the Office of the New York State Assembly, as well as some program evaluation work for nonprofits and as well as an international development organization. And I'm really excited to be here with you guys today.
Thank you. So the goals from MAD's perspective for our work with this project are really twofold. The first goal is that you commission members and the staff, see that the feedback we gather is both robust and broad, and that you're confident that you've been well informed from those that care about the guidelines as you consider various factors during the decision-making process. Secondly, a MAD goal is that the public and those professionally engaged in this work impacted by the guidelines know that their concerns have been heard and considered. So those are the goals from our perspective. So the purpose of our time here together is to hear more broadly what outcomes you all hope to achieve as a result of the guidelines review, and to help you begin to flesh out the principles that should guide the entire comprehensive review process. Now note that this is different from the previously defined principles for setting sentencing guidelines themselves, most recently found in the 2023 sentencing guidelines. Those will be included as part of the upcoming guidelines review, but we're thinking more broadly about the process itself. These conversations today will help us understand your values regarding the larger project you're engaged in and how you would like us to engage in the broader community. Next, we want to share some information about the parameters or options for public engagement before hearing your ideas about those we should reach out to and the methods to use for those interactions. Finally, we'll outline the steps we'll take to prepare for our next session together, which should be on December 14th. So that's our plan for the next 80 minutes, thereabouts. So are there any general clarifying questions that you have for us before we dig in with you in the first line of work?
I'm just gonna reframe what you said slightly.
Sure.
Because, so we had engaged MAD to initially to do just the outreach portion of the project. But then as we started to get to launching the project, we asked MAD if they could also help us facilitate our own thinking a little bit. So this first part is really about helping us facilitate our thinking, which informs them about what they need to do for stakeholder engagement. And then also we'll move into specific direction on stakeholder engagement. So I just wanted to let you know that they're here to help us as well as themselves. So it's sort of twofold today, if that makes sense.
I'm just checking around to make sure if there are any other questions we want you to have a chance to ask those first. Okay. So we'd like to begin then with the comprehensive review objectives. Now, it's really important to us that we hear from every single one of you, including the two that are joining us remotely today. So we'll be using a combination of voiced comments and written comments on an online tool called Padlet. And Nate was helping you all with that earlier. This would be a good time for you to get on your first Padlet. He's got the information and the passwords that have been passed around. You can see that you're in the right spot when you join Padlet if it looks like the one projected on the screen right now. So we'll give you just a moment to get situated, and totally fair to speak up if you've got any questions about getting on board. And while the commissioners are doing that, just a word to the observers. Know that we will be sharing our Padlet screen, as you can see up on the screen right now, so that you can see what's written comments are developing on the screen as we're working. So I'm just going to wait and make sure everybody's on board to that first Padlet. We'll start with the voice conversation, but I'd like it to flow nicely from one to the other. So I want to make sure you get onto that Padlet first.
As she's talking too, I would like to say to the commission that normally the process is that I call on people and I say your name and that's for the record, right? But I'm okay with people jumping in, but I would say if you do that, just identify yourself because that helps us with maintaining an accurate record of what's going on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Know that on this first one, we'll do a little bit of calling in order and
Sounds
we'll
good.
queue you up as best we can too. Commissioner. And Nate looks like he's on his way over to give you a hand, so hang tight. And the silence you hear, observers, is just the commissioners working to get their system set up, so your patience is appreciated. And again, if you're observing the meeting, just know that we're waiting on a bit of technology to make sure it's in good shape. So thank you for your patience.
So I had an extra tablet that has limited battery life, but as long as the battery life lives, I think
We're
we've got
good.
everybody taken care of, assuming that two online people are not having any trouble.
Very good. And we'll look to cues from staff if you're getting comments from the online members if they've got some tech issues. All right, so just to repeat, my name is Stacy Shogren. That's the voice you're hearing. I'm one of the consultants from MAD, and I'll be working with the commissioners here for the next short while to gather input from all of you. Some of that will be with your voices. Some of that will be online. Why do we do that? Because we want everybody to have as much chance for engagement as they can. We want to hear from all of you. And we know that some people formulate their thoughts perfectly with their voices. Others really want a chance to think about what they're putting down on paper. So you've got both of those options in front of you. So we're thinking about now, most generally, about the broad outcomes you hope to achieve as a result of this comprehensive guidelines review. So that's the question at hand. What outcomes do you hope to achieve as a result of this comprehensive guidelines review? So what we'd like to do to make it as easy as possible for everybody as we're learning how to use this tool is have you share your voice comments. And if you look on your screen or the screens in your room, in the first column, you'll see that Shamsa's writing down what you're verbally telling us. As you watch, you can see how she's entering it. It's pretty darn easy to just follow how she's entering it. So you should be fine that way. And so what I'd like to do to start this ball rolling verbally is turn to you, Madam Chair, for your initial thoughts on the outcomes you hope to achieve as a result. Then I'll go to the Vice Chair. Then I'll go to the 2 members that are participating remotely because we want them to feel part of this process, obviously. And then perhaps if I could, I'll start on the right and we'll work around that way. If you hear something that, gosh, that's what I was going to say, you can say, I'd like to just say that I'm agreeing with what was said earlier. You don't need to repeat. And last request, because we've got a lot of ground to cover, if you can do your best to do this in one big breath, that would be great, okay? All right, so Madam Chair, I will start with you, and if you would please verbalize your thoughts about what outcomes you hope to achieve as a result of this comprehensive guidelines review. And Shamsa will catch your comments.
So I assume that I'm just putting one idea out there because I've got 20 of them, right? So
The best and the boldest, sure.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so I have a lot of things that I'm hoping that we achieve. But honestly, the one thing that I have been consistent about and that I have said multiple times in this forum is that I want to determine if our policies are making the racial disparities that already exist at the time of sentencing any worse. So I'd like to determine if our policies are making racial disparities worse. And if we do see that, then I think we have an obligation to adjust our policies so that they don't do that any longer.
Okay. And you can see Shamsa's typing in your response. If you're concerned that she doesn't catch it quite right, you have absolute authority to interrupt me, any one of you, and we'll make sure that Shamsa gets it right because she's got to do all the keying in until we let your fingers have at the keys too. So thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Vice Chair, your thoughts.
Thank you. Adding to the chair's comments, I would say it's my goal to ensure that everything the commission does keeps in mind its primary focus, which is defined to be public safety by the legislature.
Thank you. And then I'm pretty sure, Nate, and I'll look to you to correct me if I'm wrong, but it's Commissioner Ladd and Commissioner Mueller that are virtual. So if I might ask Commissioner Ladd to come on first and share your thoughts about the outcomes you hope to achieve as a result of the comprehensive guidelines review.
Yes, thank you. And again, I'm not going to repeat anything, so if I don't say it, it doesn't mean it's not important to me. But I think there are 2 things that I think would be hoped for in this, and that would be that the guidelines are more simple. I think they're very complicated for the practitioners. And so I would hope to look at making it a more simple guideline. And then also, as we're doing that, looking at how all of the offenses are ranked and whether or not there's some consistency or inconsistencies about similar types of offenses and how they're ranked.
Thank you, Commissioner. And just so you know, everyone, I'm just going to pause occasionally, make sure Shamsa let me know if you need more time or a correction. Very good. So then Commissioner Mueller, if you come on, Mike.
Yes, thank you. Couple things just come to mind for me to piggyback a little bit on Commissioner Ladd, but I think an ease of use and or understanding is important, again, for the practitioners as well as the public. And then I think I would like to see consistency in terms of application, really thrown off a little bit by the difference in presumptive sentence versus the departures in the last presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So ease of use and
Understanding, there's some words that have kind of come to mind: ease of use, ease of understanding, and then consistency in application.
consistency. Very good. Thank you. Very good. So now we'll go in the room, starting from my right, all the way around to the left, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Reeves. What I would like to see is increased transparency around the guidelines and why we do what we do, why the body recommends what it does for public safety purposes for the victims as well as the defendants. And as a probation officer, ease of use would be so much easier. I just have to fill it out there because sometimes it's very hard to do the guidelines if you do them over and over again. So thank you.
It was ease of use, you said? Yes, reiterating ease of use. Very good. Thank you. Commissioner. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two ideas. One is that I'd like to determine through this process whether there are additional offenses that need to have an established severity level that aren't specifically enumerated in the guidelines. As a practitioner, I have run into this problem with certain types of offenses not having any guidance in the state sentencing guidelines. And secondly, I think this has been said, but I would like to look at policies to mitigate the racial disparity that we saw in the presentation today.
Very good.
Can you repeat this first one, please?
The first one.
The first one.
So I would like to look at whether there are offenses, crimes that we should establish a severity level for in the guidelines that currently do not have an established severity level, and the court is left to their own discretion to determine the severity level for those offenses. Because I believe that our state prosecutors are expanding the scope of offenses that they prosecute more recently, and it would be better to provide guidance to the courts about the established severity level for those offenses that aren't listed.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that Shamsa has the hardest job of everybody in this room right now.
Yeah. Could you also repeat the second one as well, too?
I think the second one has been said, so I will just save you from having to repeat that one.
And let's see, Commissioner Moran.
I guess what I had wrote down was to balance penalties so that they're proportionately fair and rational through better data collection, broadening the spectrum as far as casting the net out wider to gain more information to help us be more successful in our future recommendations.
Okay, very good. Commissioner.
It's kind of already been said, but reduce the mistakes. We see so many mistakes that we have to correct as a court, but so simplify, clarify, and that would all help better understanding, which I believe then would lead to stronger buy-in in the guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Commissioner Moore, sorry, I get shadows or reflections sometimes, so it's hard to see the names.
Thank you. In addition to the good comments that have already been made, I think I would like to look through the guidelines to see what we could eliminate or edit that regarding guidelines that are just either outdated, not making sense, or not being applied right. As a practitioner and as a judge, I think we see these guidelines that sometimes just don't seem to make a lot of sense. We wonder why they're there. And so I think we should be looking to see if we can address those.
Thank you. And then over to Commissioner Fraze.
Okay, thank you. What they said, but I hope we can valuable and feasible changes to make in the guidelines that will help the guidelines better achieve, especially in light of changes that have happened since. And changes that are achievable so that our work bears fruit.
Thank you. Okay. Commissioner, is it Morath?
Yes,
Thank you.
I'll echo previous statements as well, and I'd like to see an emphasis on the public safety aspect and really exploring predictive validity of the sentencing and just identifying what is working and what is not.
You said predictive?
Yeah, how effective are the sentences in achieving that public safety outcome?
Very good. Thank you. And Commissioner Middlebrook?
We can't hear Commissioner Middlebrook.
Okay, sorry. Forgot to turn the button on.
Hold your microphone down a little bit too.
Okay.
There you go.
So should I repeat that? Okay, so in addition to what's been said, which was a lot of what I had also written down, I'd like to just add to the looking at policies that are not only making racial disparities or to try to reduce some of the racial disparities, but also the geographical disparities, because I feel like where you are in the state of Minnesota, where your sentence should not make a difference if it's the same crime and same criminal history that we're looking at. So I think that that's another area that hopefully we can do something to improve. Also, just adding on to looking at ranking of offenses, it is concerning that there's this really high departure rates, especially that are the ones that are not, that are mitigated departures from the presumptive guidelines. And I think that we can look at those and hopefully get to rankings that will make more sense and reduce that gap in the presumptive versus what the sentences are. So I guess those are a couple of things that I would add into there.
Thank you. And finally, Commissioner Crutchfield.
Yes, really building upon what the other commissioners have said. Really, if the purpose of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is public safety, an alignment between the goal of actual public safety and the outcomes that we're getting. And really, stress testing that. So for example, does a longer prison sentence increase public safety? Things like that.
Thank you all. One of the jobs of any body such as yours is to start making sense of streams of information. And to start doing that, we would encourage all of you to look at your own Padlet on your own screen where Shamsa has been entering this information. You can control being able to see everything that's been entered in that by just moving the toggle that you see to the right of the first white box and sliding it down. So you've got total control over your screen. For those that are observing, in a moment, Shamsa will start scrolling up and down on her screen so the public can see those items. What I'd ask of you right now, commissioners, is to help me look through those and see if you're starting to see any themes that might have merged, or how are you making sense of what's been put in there by each of you individually through Shamsa's fingers. So what are you seeing in there? Or perhaps right now it's just really still a laundry list of hopes. Can you make any sense out of what you see there yet? Yeah, Commissioner, go ahead.
Commissioner Reeves, looks like we want consistency. We want
Come again?
consistency in application across the state. Balancing priorities, practices, policies with what we're doing and was actually application in the field. That's kind of what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yeah. What else are the rest of you seeing as you're looking through the sum total of what you're hoping to achieve? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to call on Commissioner Mueller. Online. Thank you.
Thank you. I just think it's, we should point out that through whatever lens or whatever we're trying to find out, or whatever data we're trying to glean, the phrase public safety has been mentioned several times, and then that's sort of a mission of this group.
Yep, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna point out public safety as well, and if I could add something to the list, it would be for us to reach a common understanding of what public safety means and how we could measure that, or how do we know we've achieved it?
And funny you should mention that, because if you look at column 2, that's a space for all of you now, as you're starting to make sense of what's been entered into column 1, if you have more thoughts about that overall objectives, that's a column that you can start adding into. So go ahead and take use of that as we're continuing to work here. Again, part of this process is that we know some of you can verbalize your thoughts, but others need time to reflect and want to get them right before they commit them out into the public space. So this is a chance for you to do that and add your own thoughts again in column 2. Were you going to say something else?
I was going to say the other consistency that I feel like I heard almost everybody say, and I would have said it if I could have said 20 things, was simplicity. It seems like we all are striving for a simpler set of guidelines, if we can get there.
Judging from the number of words that are in the current one for your earlier conversation, yeah. Yes, Commissioner Crutchfield.
There also seemed to be the idea of fairness, whether it's racial disparity, or geographical disparity, rural versus urban. It seemed like the idea that this should be fair to all.
Very good. Unless there's an objection, I'd like to move you on to the next line of thinking, and that has all to do with guiding principles. Reminder, you've got that column 2, so if there are any last stray thoughts about overarching objectives, that's where you can put them. What we'd like to have you do now, though, is start developing some principles to guide the overarching review process. That's from public engagement to research to the commissioner's interactions. What are your guiding principles as you're moving through, and we along with you and others through this process? So at this stage, though, we're just asking you to generate solid ideas. I know the temptation is to wordsmith it and get it exactly right now. That's not a worthy use of all of your time right now. We're looking for some general ideas about guiding principles. Our job at MAD is to take those ideas and come back to you at the December meeting, having crystallized those a little bit more, where you can really get into that fine tuning mode. Commissioner, is it
It's Saxena, thank you.
Saxena.
I think a guiding principle should be to rely on objective data whenever possible, and to allow yourself to be convinced by data, even if you may already hold a different view about what public safety looks like or about how to achieve a particular goal. So sort of a data-driven review.
Excellent, very good, thank you. And to start that ball rolling in general thoughts, I'm going to turn back over then to the chair and then the vice chair, and we just want to get like 5 or more, just get the juices flowing about general principles. And then you might have already seen on your Padlets, we've got queued up a couple more specific questions related to guiding principles, where we're going to give you all quiet time to really get into the quiet of your own brains and formulate your thoughts. So I'll turn back to the chair, Madam Chairperson, and then the vice chair, and open it up to maybe a couple more comments, and then let you loose. All right?
So one thing I think is really important to me is that I would love it if we could reach consensus, but I think that there may be times we just have to call the vote. So I think we should strive for a consensus, but realize that sometimes we may have to call the vote.
And Madam Vice Chair?
One principle I think that should guide our review is that we can't ignore public sentiment. We've received lots of public comments over the year about our work. At the end of the process, I think it's important that we receive that information and consider it throughout the process, so we don't put a lot of time and effort into something that in the end might be rejected by the public.
Thank you. So I'm just doing a quick look at our two remote commissioners, and just to see if you've got anything that you'd want to add in on general guiding principles before I look more carefully in the room. And seeing none, I'll turn to the room, to the commissioners here. Are there any others that want to weigh in verbally on general, more overarching guiding principles for this overall engagement? You good? Okay. Then the next task in front of you is to, in the quiet of your own minds, with your key or hands on your own keyboard, go ahead and look at columns 4 and columns 5. We've got two questions that are a bit more specific in terms of guiding principles. The first is, are there specific guiding principles that you'd want us all engaged in the research activities to be bearing in mind as you're moving through that process? What's important to you in terms of guiding principles for research activities? That's column 4. Column 5, where you can add your own thoughts, is what specific principles should guide your own interactions amongst yourselves? Are you going to show up in terms of guiding principles throughout this entire process? So I'll give you time to think about that, and then go ahead. And as those thoughts occur to you, go ahead and put your own entries into columns 4 and columns 5, and we'll just be comfortable in a bit of silence together while you're working.
Do we have the ability to put anything in the other columns if we have a thought there, or is it just 4 and 5 at this point?
Oh, no, that's fine. You certainly go to column 2 if you had some residual thoughts about overall objectives. That's where those would go. And if you've got more thoughts about guiding principles for the comprehensive review process, certainly put those in 3. Don't mean to cut off that conversation by any means. Did that answer your question?
It did, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions on your directions? Very good then. And all observers, we're just being busy here in the room, formulating our own thoughts. Just a reminder, members, you can move that toggle down. Look for the gray toggle to the right of each column. And this is a note to observers. The silence is intentional here in the room. We're just giving the commissioners time to do their own entries onto the screen that you see. And our staff member is slowly scrolling up and down on each of the screens so you can read what's being entered. And commissioners, I absolutely do not want to cut anybody off, but when you have kind of finished out, just give me a nonverbal something so I know when we've got a critical mass, and I'll keep moving. Madam Chair, reading the room, what do you think from your perspective? Couple more. Commissioners that are finished, I'll be asking those same two questions about columns 4 and 5. Help us make sense of what you're seeing there. So if you take some time now and scroll up and down those columns on your own, we'll have that same conversation. What are we seeing here? How are we making sense of the different perspectives that you're bringing to the table? And who in the room needs more time? Good, very good. So again, the voice that you're hearing is Stacy Sjogren. I'm a senior consultant with MAD. I've been working with the commissioners on processes to start laying out the groundwork for their comprehensive guidelines review. We're getting our own thoughts squared away on our overall objectives and the guiding principles that will impact how we approach the different elements of this work. So if we all look at columns 4 now and 5, starting with 4, as you scroll up and down that list of input from all of you commissioners, how are you making sense of what's here in this column? Are there some themes that you're seeing in regards to principles that should guide research activities? How are you making sense of what's there? And for the observers, just know that they're all taking in all of the comments in that column. I realize it takes a while to get through it. And perhaps they're just all coming from different directions, and there's no sense there that can, yeah, go ahead.
I think a couple of the comments are pointing to the need for additional data, not multiple sources of data, I guess. So we definitely have the guidelines data, but it may not show the full picture. So I'm seeing some desire for additional sources of data to be pulled into the analysis.
I'm seeing some nods of agreement there. Any other sense-making comments that others would care to make on what you're seeing in that column 4? And I know I've got a hands up here, but is this here? Oh, Commissioner Ladd, is that your hand up? I'm trying to read
Yes.
what's on the screen. Go ahead.
Yes, it
My
is.
apologies.
Thank you.
Not everything is labeled on the screen that I'm able to access.
No worries.
Please, go ahead.
If I had to pluck a theme from column 4, I would say that it's obviously data driven, but I think what I'm also seeing in that same column is that the data needs to be reliable and it needs to be complete, as opposed to incomplete data for which maybe inferences are being made erroneously. So I think if we're using data, it has to be reliable data from which we sort of make decisions and use it for any kind of analysis.
Thank you, Commissioner Ladd. And I don't know if you can see in the room, but I'm seeing head nods to what you're saying too. Okay. Any other final comments on how you're making sense of what's in that column 4? Good. So same process, looking at what's in column 5, specific to how to guide your own interactions. What are the guiding principles you want to hold for yourselves as you're working on this overarching project? How are you making sense of what you're seeing here? Are there themes? And what might those themes be? So hearing none, and I don't want to rush you along, so interrupt me if you've got some thoughts. Are you all okay with our team stepping back then and doing our own sense making and coming back to you, at least on these 2 columns, right? Or not these 2 columns, but the overarching objectives and what we're hearing from you in terms of guiding principles, and bring some more formulated thoughts to you for reactions at the December meeting. You good? You good? Okay. So now we need to do a quick chair change between Charlie and myself, because he's going to take over and you're really going to start focusing in on that public engagement aspect. So give us a moment and we'll switch out chairs.
Thanks, Stacy. So Charlie Selu here again. And yeah, now we invite you, as you see on Shantha's computer, to switch to the second Padlet. So you'll know that you're in the right place if it looks green instead of red as the background. So I'll give the commissioners a moment to follow the link to the second Padlet and join us over there. So let me know if there's anyone who needs assistance getting to the second Padlet. So here we're going to continue the conversation that we just had about guiding principles, but think about the principles that we're going to use specifically with the engagement work that we do. So we're going to talk today about engagement and then really bring back a lot of this into the December meeting, but wanted to begin with the guiding principles. And you'll see on the kind of questions that we have here are going to be where we're going to go in a minute of like the how. But I do, because we were just talking about the principles, want to think about the Padlet one. So we could go back to the to the Padlet. Jonathan, sorry to keep moving you around. We're going to think about the specific principles we bring to work experience and to lived experience. And those are our terms, but what we mean by them are, in terms of work experience, the people who are interacting with the guidelines as a document because they work for the judicial branch, or they work for a prosecutor, or for a defense attorney or public defender, or have some other kind of work connection to the criminal justice system. Whereas when we're thinking about the engagement with people with lived experience, that's more thinking about defendants, about crime victims and their families, people who have a lived experience connection to the criminal justice system more broadly, but may not have a work connection to the sentencing guidelines. Any clarifying questions about how we're kind of thinking about those questions? So then we'll follow a similar process that we just used, where I'll invite the chair and vice chair to first kind of share some ideas, and then some additional ideas voiced in the room. And then we'll kind of release you to continue to add comments on the virtual Padlet. So on that first question, Madam Chair, of principles that would guide our work with people with work experience, with people who are interacting with the guidelines in their jobs, are there any principles that we should bring to that you would highlight for us?
So this is guiding engagement.
Yes, engagement. This is how do we engage with the people who work with the guidelines? Thank you.
My God, do you have one? I didn't think about this one. Let me just verbalize, and maybe something will come out the other end. I'm just gonna start talking. It feels like, these are the individuals that have to work with the guidelines every day and have to have facility with the guidelines. And so something that really gives them an opportunity to tell us what the pain points are when they do that. I don't know what that looks like, but that's what I want to get out of that engagement, if that is relevant for this question.
No, it's very helpful. Thank you. Vice Chair, what would you add?
I agree with the chair, and I think what I'd like to know is what suggestions people have. I think everybody has ideas once they're into the guidelines about how this could be better, or maybe there's something we don't need to do or we should do differently. It seems this would be a good time to collect that information.
Thank you. Would any other commissioners like to verbally add any thoughts to principles that would guide our engagement with people who work with the guidelines? Yes, Commissioner?
Well, I think along those same lines, but solicit exact details and descriptions. The chair talked about the pain point. Is, boy, they know where the problems are. They know where the issues are. It just seems there's so many hoops and factors, and then check, and then go to that other provision, and then determine that other factor until you can even get to the recommendation as to what the guidelines even say. That's my perception. Well, that's my frustration. I think it's the same with probation. In making the recommendations to us, in making those determinations. Sometimes they're wrong because they missed a step, or they're relatively new agent. So really to define the details of their issues, struggles.
Thank you. Any other verbal comments? Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you. Kind of adding on to the sort of looking at the pain points for practitioners, I think there's also included in that are just some of the confusing provisions that keep coming up, and maybe there's two different interpretations on those. That would be something that we would want to look at and get that information from them. Particularly, I think our staff gets a lot of questions, and so even from them, some of the recurring questions that keep coming into staff would be good points for us to also get that in, so we'd have that information.
Yes, Commissioner.
I was going to add, asking practitioners and judges for specific case examples if they have a specific case that illustrates the issue that they would like to see fixed or an unfairness that they have seen caused by the application of the guidelines would be very helpful.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll invite, oh yeah, go ahead.
I agree, and on the other end of that spectrum, just really given an open-ended opportunity for practitioners to talk about how they feel about the guidelines, and thoughts they have about the guidelines, but just open, because they might have thoughts or ideas that we didn't even think of.
Thank you. So we'll invite you in a moment to add additional ones virtually, but let's continue the conversation verbally for a moment on that second column. So Chair, I'll go back to you to ask, what specific principles would you give us to guide engagement with people with lived experience? What should we keep in mind as we engage people who are defendants or victims or their families or others with more lived experiences interacting with the criminal justice system?
I think again, I'm only able to speak to what I'm hoping to learn from these populations. And so when I think about defendants, I want to learn whether the guidelines even make sense to them. Do they understand what they're facing in terms of a sentence? And when I think about the public in general, which could be their family members or, any member of the public who's hearing about this particular crime that took place, I want to know what their perceptions of fairness are. Are the guidelines fair? And it's more than fairness. It's are we hitting the mark in terms of their expectations for appropriate sentencing?
Thank you. Madam Vice Chair, what would you add?
I think I'd like to defer to Commissioner Morath because I think she's got an important viewpoint. I would assume. I don't have anything to add to what the chair has said, though, except that, one thing that appears to be missing to me is specific principles to guide engagement, which is the public at large, somebody who's not been a victim, but somebody who watches the TV, reads the news, and has strong feelings. How do we engage those people about what they think should be done differently and why?
And what would you, yeah, no, that's helpful. And what would you, I think in our mind, we were including that in column 2, but you're right, that isn't very clear. And so what guidance would you give us or what principles would you give us for that more broad public engagement?
I don't know. It seems like the public's been more than willing to speak up if they're invited to do so. So I think as long as we have a way to publicize what we're doing and that information is being collected from everybody and is going to be considered by everybody, I think you'll get feedback. Just a matter of asking for it.
Thank you. Commissioner Morath, did you want to go ahead?
Yep, I would just say, if we're talking about victims from the research side, formulating questions, keeping in mind that this is a very broad spectrum of individuals, and you're going to find some who have a very nuanced understanding of, the criminal justice system and sentencing policies, and others who have really no familiarity whatsoever. And so keeping in mind, in order to get, information that is helpful, structuring questions based upon individual. And also, it should go without saying, the utmost respect when dealing with this sensitive population.
Thank you. So yeah, the people have a wide variety of exposure to the system in terms of the guidelines and just the underlying respect. So go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Reese. To kind of expand out Commissioner Morath about secondary trauma in the community and how what we define as a victim may look different as people that have lived experience of someone that has went through something in their household or someone close to them and how that impacts them. We often talk about victims as the person that actually went through something. And then perhaps if it's a significant offense like a murder, you may think of the family at large, but other offenses, you may not think of the family. Someone may have had trauma in their childhood and something happened to a family member, and now that has brought up a lot of different things and it's impacted them. So we have to just think about secondary trauma. We talk about this. Thank you.
Secondary. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Chair.
I wanted to add, when we do engage the public more broadly, I think that we also need specific information, right? We had some really good conversations last year with a few members of the public that followed one of our issues, and sort of as we got to the end, we realized, that some, that one of the individuals like had really specific concerns about certain areas of sentencing that they didn't think that the guidelines were hitting correctly. And that's what we need to know. Like, we need those specifics. Like, it's not helpful to us if people say sentencing sucks and, every sentence is too lenient or whatever.
Yeah.
But when they say, I don't think sentencing for DWI is correct, I think that people get off too lightly. Like, that helps us understand where we need to focus our attention, right? Or, so I guess.
Specifics is what you're
Specifics.
saying.
Yeah, drawing out the specifics.
We need to be able to draw out those specifics, just like you were saying, we need that from the practitioners. That's going to be like 2B2 needs to be changed, right? But
Right.
from the public, it's going to be,
Different, right.
up a level, but still more specific would be helpful.
Which is why we'll be separating out those kinds of engagements. Because
Right.
they know people are coming at this from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's too difficult to put them in the same
right
focus group, if you will.
Yep. So we're going to shift now and invite you to add to the Padlet across actually all of these columns. So I'll talk through what 1 and 2 are again, and then a little bit more on 3 and 4. So 1 and 2 are in 1, kind of general principles that are specific to how we engage people who have a kind of work connection to the guidelines themselves. 2 is principles to guide how we engage with people with lived experience and the public more broadly. And then 3 is, if you have any thoughts considering those principles more tactically for us, what are the implications for how we should be engaging? And I realize it's kind of a fuzzy line between the principles and kind of the tactical implications. So put them wherever it feels natural to you. But if you have things that you feel are more tactical or more implications for how we should be doing the engagement, those can go in column 3. And then column 4 is really just a catch-all. If there are other initial ideas or direction you want to give us for how we go about engagement at this stage, we welcome that additional kind of feedback early on in column 4. So any clarifying questions about those different columns? I'll invite you to begin using your Padlet to, as you've been watching Shamsa do, just kind of press the plus button in whichever column you'd like to add an additional comment. And then we'll kind of wait for the group to be ready to make some meaning together. So take about another minute to continue to add. So as you wrap up adding additional comments to this Padlet, I'll turn to kind of the verbal conversation of, does anyone want to share anything that stands out to them or that they're noticing about the comments that are being added so far that they want to elevate in the room today? Similar to what Stacy mentioned on the objectives and principles, we will do our own meaning making and bring back to you sort of our synthesis of what you all have said for your kind of feedback and reaction in December. But would welcome any initial reflections if anyone wants to share any. Yes, Madam Chair.
I feel like what I'm seeing is a desire to have broad engagement, to meet people where they're at, maybe ensure that some of the engagement is occurring off hours or through other organizations that might be able to get the word out, that we're looking for feedback. So that's some of what I'm seeing.
Thank you. Any other final comments? Yeah, Commissioner.
I think there's, excuse me, I think there's a very common theme, it seems like, between everybody to ensure that the engagements are performed in a manner that feels safe to everybody, and to ensure that there's a trust and they give the proper information, because there's a lack of trust when it comes to some of these situations. So I think that's very important, and I'm very pleased to see that there's a common denominator between that.
Thank you. So I'll turn it over to Shamsa for the next part of the engagement planning conversation, where we'll talk about the initial categories that we've identified and get your feedback on who we're missing or who else we should be adding to our list.
All right, so as you guys noticed, we have provided 2 potential categories. So when the first categories are those who have work experience interacting with the sentencing guidelines, and the other category is those who have lived experiences interacting with the criminal justice system more broadly. So we would like to know, are there any other categories that you guys feel like should be added on here? Do you think this should be modified or expanded? So let me know your thoughts.
It's in the WebEx. We can read it aloud too, if that's helpful. It should be in the WebEx meeting though. But Shamsa, could you read the?
Yeah, got it. Okay, so for the first category, work experience interacting with the sentencing guidelines. Those include judges, judicial staff, prosecutors and county attorney staff, public defenders and other defense attorneys, law enforcement, as well as professional and advocacy organizations. And then the second category we have is those with lived experiences interacting with the criminal justice system more broadly. So that includes criminal defendants, incarcerated people and their families, crime victims and their families, communities of color, as well as the general public.
Can you tell me where probation officers, not specifically named, but potentially you say professional? I'm just kind of curious about that.
So where do they fit? Okay.
Yeah, so I would think they would fit in the first category, which are those who work, who have experience interacting with the sentencing guidelines.
I just didn't see them named.
No, yeah.
Yeah, so this isn't this is not an exhaustive list, but
That's actually a good thing. So
Yeah.
we're taking notes today on that feedback. That's a great addition.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Commissioner Knudsen.
We're kind of, we kind of had this issue before. So we got those that are experienced interacting with the guidelines and then lived experiences interacting with the criminal justice system. We hope that the majority of the people that we serve, which is all the citizens in the state of Minnesota, don't interact with the criminal justice system.
And you want to hear
Aren't
from them
they-
as well.
Aren't, but they
Right.
live with the system.
Yeah.
So you've got the general public listed under people that have lived experience interacting with the system, but
Right.
those that haven't acted with the system, but they sure have opinions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're going to be speaking up and they're going to wonder what kind of community they're living in with these guidelines or this type of criminal justice system.
So what I'm-
Is that separate? Is that, how do we engage that?
Yeah, and how we engage, I don't know, but I'm hearing that it does make sense to elevate that. So we've got three separate
Separate categories. Yeah.
Thank you
I
for
think
that.
the way we're thinking about it is going back to the conversation before around the different level of knowledge people are going to bring about, are they referencing a specific section of the guidelines, or are they more mentioning DWI offenses, or they have broader feedback? And so we want to make sure the questions we're asking, the way that we structure our engagement is going to be different depending on the kind of language people are going to bring to the conversation. So that's a helpful kind of additional, like to maybe move the general public and maybe also communities of color over to like a third category that isn't as much criminal justice experience. It's just kind of the general public.
Yes, Commissioner.
I think that's very important because I mean, at the end of the day, the public is relatively well informed. And I think if the public's going to buy into the work we do and the decisions we make and the guidelines when they they disagree with it, we have to hear from them to know, okay, what's your sense of justice? What's your sense of rehabilitation? What do you expect from the system? And that might be different than people who are working in the system who have experienced the system, but it's an important voice because at the end of the day, there are way more of them than us. So we need to include that feedback.
Thank you.
And those could perhaps be much more general questions.
Who else are we missing? We talked about, so we've kind of talked about elevating the general public in a different way. Probation officers is kind of a specific group that we didn't enumerate that we should. Are there others?
Are there others that we've missed? Yeah.
So you haven't missed this, and maybe today is not the time to talk about it, but when you say law enforcement, who do you mean? Because that can mean a lot of different types of people that have interaction with the criminal justice system, some of whom have much more exposure to the guidelines and some of whom do not. So I was just, when the time comes, I'd be interested in hearing the commission's thoughts on how we select that group.
Yeah. Do you have some immediate thoughts too?
Well, I mean, I think if you're interviewing a number of BCA agents and officers, you're going to hear a very different take than you will if you're hearing from, patrol officers. And I also think that you're going to be hearing a pretty different take if you're talking to folks that are policing really wide swaths of greater Minnesota. And so I just think that's a very broad group. Whereas if you're talking to prosecutors, they're all having a much more similar experience with the guidelines probably than the variety of law enforcement officers are.
Yes, Commissioner.
Exactly to Commissioner Sexton's point. I also think a vertical slice is important because when you talk about a day-to-day prosecutor, that's different than John Choi. I just picked on John, right? So if you ask John or his staff, you might get a whole different experience than you will a frontline person who's prosecuting on a day-to-day.
I noted the regional piece that was embedded in that previous one too, that
Yeah.
people may have different experiences in different parts of the state or different traditional districts.
And I think that that really, when you're looking at systems people, that is something to really keep in mind. I mean, I worked for 17 years in corrections, and where corrections administration and where probation officers were, a lot of times were completely different places. So when looking at all of these, to vertical slice it down in.
Yeah, and Commissioner Ladd on the WebEx.
Thank you. I was going to jump in and talk about the geography piece because while we all deal with the same statutes and the same guidelines, there is a very different lived experience with the system in greater Minnesota than in the metro area. And not only from prosecutors and, you know, the public defenders or private attorneys out in this part of the state, I'd also say with the probation folks, and we have 3 different kinds of probation entities in the state of Minnesota that all function differently and have different actually policies that sort of drive what and how they do. And so I think that it's important to have a representation across the state, because I will just tell you, I don't prosecute drive-by shootings and carjackings where I'm at. But that's taken up a lot of press and a lot of effort and energy that we've dealt with this last legislative session. So those are the kinds of nuances that are very different in terms of people's experiences and things. And so I just think the geography piece is really, really important to make sure that we are covering the entire state, not just the metro.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Nate?
So I know I'm not on the commission, but I just want to lift up my staff, your staff. They have a very concentrated interaction with how the sentencing guidelines work. They're kind of the hub of a lot of problems that probation officers or other practitioners might have with the sentencing guidelines. So I would lift them up as a resource of people who kind of know what some of the problems are.
Any other additions? Madam Chair, yeah.
I was going to say, if we look at all the representation on the commission, treatment provider is another category. And it's really important to have effective treatment in order for probation to work. So understanding, I think having some input from treatment providers through this process is also going to be very important.
Thank you. That's a good segue to just to preview a little bit of what we're going to be coming back in December to think about. Is we're going to bring back both our synthesis of what you came up with in terms of the principles around engagement. We'll update the categories to reflect your feedback. And then we'll also work in December to get your ideas and initial input on how we connect with these different categories of people. Obviously, the commission itself is connected to different groups kind of structurally, but we'll want to get thinking about how we connect those different groups, how we make sure we get representation geographically, on the systems level piece of how are we getting both people on the more patrol officer role versus investigator versus a more systems leader, and get your feedback there. And then while we've started to talk about this today, we'll get more concentrated feedback and input from you all on what we want to learn when we talk to these different groups, because there might be different questions we have for the people who interact with the guidelines as we're trying to think about the simplicity goals, for example, versus what we're asking, as we've been saying, of the general public, where we're trying to ensure a broader sense of support and acceptance kind of the guidelines. And so we'll come back and want to get a deeper conversation on what are the questions we're asking and what are we trying to learn, both in general, what are we trying to learn from everyone, and then what are we trying to learn specifically from some of the different segments of groups that we've identified today. So that's kind of a little bit of a preview of where we're going in our December meeting together on the engagement front. Is there anything anyone wants to raise that you think is missing, not in terms of the categories, but in terms of our process? Yeah, Commissioner.
If I could just add, Commissioner Reeves, perhaps going to the professional organizations that deal with stakeholders like MACAC, MCA, MACPO,
Yeah.
would be helpful, because they'll be talking about some of this stuff, what they're seeing with staff, and some issues, and so it might be helpful to ask them some questions, the presidents. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's both in a direct way, as kind of in the same way that we were mentioning of the commission staff has lots of knowledge. Some of the association staff may have lots of knowledge. In addition, they may be really helpful in connecting us to their members and to people, especially as we try to get coverage across the state and across those other categories. They can be really useful. So we'll really welcome those ideas. So start thinking over the next month about what are those different ways we would connect with those groups? What are the different questions we would have for those different groups? And we'll have a full conversation about those in our December meeting.
I think Commissioner Larkin, did you have a comment too?
Just going to suggest that in addition to commission staff, I think everybody in the room probably has a thought about what should be different about the guidelines, and at what point do we like collect among ourselves and add that to the pile of the information.
Interesting question. Yeah. Well, Cece, I will hand it back to you
Yeah.
for kind of a next steps conversation.
And I think we've covered a lot of the next steps. You know that we're coming back in December to share our compilation based on your input and our best thinking. So there'll be more conversation there. If you've got any feedback for us on technology or things that would be helpful for us to know, perhaps like Padlet, for example, maybe funnel those through Nate or come to us directly, because we of course want to make sure that you're feeling that you can contribute. The whole idea of having both verbal and written opportunities is to make sure everybody has confidence that their voice has been heard one way or another. So with that, I think the only thing we have left to do is say sincerely, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your best thinking. We look forward to going through it with more detail as we formulate our plans for our next meeting together.
And thank you for coming and walking us through this exercise. It was really kind of fascinating to me to hear everyone's thoughts, and it's actually great to start to get the ideas on the table. So thank you so much for helping us work through that. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Nate for the executive director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm moving over here because the next thing after the executive director's report is going to be public comments. And there are some members of the public on the call. If anybody would like to make a public comment to the commission, please raise your hand. You should be able to raise your hands. I'm having trouble finding the participant list here. Oh, there it is. Okay, yes, I see staff members on there. So if you would please raise your hand, I think everybody should be able to raise their hands. All right. So as far as my report, it's pretty brief. We are beginning the hiring process for the 2 vacant research staff. And now that we have the news from Arnold Ventures that there's been preliminary approval of the research proposal by the team at the University of Minnesota, I think we have some clarity on hiring the temporary position. So we were also funded for a temporary research analyst, and I think we now have a clearer view of what that person's going to be doing. Really, a lot of that person's role depended on whether the Arnold Ventures proposal was granted. So the next meeting, I believe, will be back at Afton Room, and it will be in 5 weeks. So a little bit of a break for you. It's not quite as the every 4-week meeting time period. It'll be December 14th. So we will see you back then, and that's really all I had to report, Madam Chair.
All right, and then does anyone have any questions for Nate before we move on? Okay, then why don't you see if we have anyone, any members of the public who would like to make a comment today?
I don't see any hands raised, Madam Chair.
I don't
Oh,
either.
there's a-
Oh, there we go.
Okay, there we go. Going to unmute this person. All right, please state your name and provide your comment to the commission.
My name is Cynthia Johnson.
Go ahead.
My comment is I've sent in a few requests and I realize that you folks are getting ready to consider some sentencing guideline changes. And the only thing I have to say is please, please look at the DWI. 48 months for killing someone when you're driving 90 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, to only see them get 48 months is just not right. And I realize you're going to look at this as a whole, but my stepson's life is worth more than 48 months. And so is everyone else's that's been affected. Every other day, someone's driving drunk. We see it on the news. It's just getting worse and worse. We go to the prosecutors hoping for help. They tell us they can't do anything because these are what the guidelines are. We really, as a public, feel stuck. We feel hopeless. And we just hope that you'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. We really appreciate it. Is there anybody else?
No, that was, let me double check, but yeah, that was the only hand.
All right. All right, so with that, we've reached the end of our agenda for the day. So we will go ahead and adjourn for today, and then I will see you all back here in December, and we will be looking for more of your work as we continue to scope out the comprehensive review. Thanks so much for all of the work that you all did today. It was a great conversation. Unless there's any objection, the meeting is adjourned.